October 732, somewhere between the cities of Tours and Poitiers in what is now France. The ground trembles, not from an earthquake, but from the thunder of thousands of hooves pounding the earth. Dust clouds rise on the horizon like a sandstorm transplanted from the deserts of Arabia. The Umayyad cavalry, the most feared fighting force in the world, sweeps across the Frankish countryside like a scythe through wheat. They've come a long way, from Damascus, across North Africa, through Spain, over the Pyrenees. They've conquered an empire that stretches from the borders of India to the Atlantic Ocean in less than a century. Every army that has stood before them has broken. Every kingdom that has resisted has fallen. And now, blocking their path to the treasures of the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours, stands a wall. Not of stone, but of men. Frankish warriors gripping their spears and shields, standing shoulder to shoulder in tight formation, silent, unmoving, like a forest that has suddenly grown in the path of the storm. At the centre of this human wall stands a man. He's not a king. He's not even technically the ruler of Francia. But when he raises his hammer, his weapon of choice that will give him his name, every man in that formation knows one thing with absolute certainty. They will hold, or they will die. His name is Charles. History will call him Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. And this moment, this battle, will determine whether Europe remains Christian or becomes part of the Islamic Caliphate. But here's the question that should keep you hooked. How did a bastard son, written out of his inheritance, imprisoned by his own family, rise to become the man who would change the course of Western civilization? If you enjoy stories from history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more like this. And drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing where this story is being heard. Now, let's return to the story. Let's rewind, because Charles Martel's story doesn't begin with glory, it begins with the word that defined him in the eyes of Frankish nobility: bastard. Born around 688 AD, the exact date is lost to history because bastards didn't get careful birth records, Charles was the illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia. Now, that title needs some explaining, because Frankish politics in the late 600s was beautifully, magnificently weird. Technically, Francia was ruled by kings from the Merovingian dynasty, but here's the thing. These kings had become so powerless, so ceremonial, that historians would later call them the do-nothing kings. The real power lay with the mayors of the palace, officials who had started as chief administrators, but had essentially staged the slowest, most bureaucratic coup in history. Pepin of Herstal was one of these shadow rulers, and he was good at it. He'd unified the fractured Frankish kingdoms, he'd beaten back external threats, he'd made the office of mayor of the palace hereditary in his family. He was by all accounts the actual ruler of Francia. But Charles was a problem. His mother was a woman named Alpaida, and here's where the sources get fuzzy. She might have been a concubine, she might have been a second wife in a bigamous marriage. The church definitely didn't recognise the union, which in the early 8th century meant Charles had all the legitimacy of a counterfeit coin. Pepin had legitimate sons from his wife Plectrude. Drogo and Grimoald, they were the heirs. They got the education, the training, the political connections. Charles got, well, we don't know what Charles got. The historical record goes quiet on his childhood, which tells you everything you need to know about how the family viewed him. But Charles had something his half-brothers didn't. We can infer this from what comes later. He had his father's talent for warfare, his strategic mind, and apparently an absolute refusal to accept the role that birth had assigned him. Then, in 714, everything changed. Pepin of Herstal died. On his deathbed, he did something that shocked everyone. He didn't clearly name a successor. Some sources say he wanted Charles to inherit, others say he was too ill to express his wishes. What we know for certain is what happened next. Plectrude, Pepin's widow, made her move. Plectrude was not a woman to be underestimated. In a world where widows were expected to retire to convents and pray for their dead husbands' souls, she decided instead to rule Francia herself, nominally in the name of her grandson Theudebald, who was maybe 6 years old. And her first act as de facto ruler, she had Charles arrested and thrown into prison. Think about the calculation here. Charles was probably in his mid-20s, a trained warrior, the son of the most powerful man in Francia, and he had supporters. Plectrude couldn't kill him, that would create martyrs and trigger blood feuds, but she couldn't let him roam free either. So, prison. We don't know which prison, we don't know the conditions. What we know is that Charles, the man who would save Christian Europe, spent the months after his father's death in a cell, watching as his stepmother tried to hold together an empire that was rapidly falling apart. Because Francia, it turns out, didn't respond well to being ruled by a widow and a child. The Neustrians, the Franks from the western regions, immediately rebelled. They defeated Plectrude's forces at the Battle of Compiègne in 715. The Saxons saw weakness and raided across the borders. The Frisians rose up in the north, and the Aquitanians in the south decided this was a great time to assert their independence. Francia was fracturing, and Plectrude, for all her political skill, didn't have the one thing you needed to hold together a warrior kingdom in the 8th century, the ability to personally lead armies into battle. Charles, rotting in prison, must have heard the news, must have known that the kingdom was tearing itself apart. Must have known that he, bastard though he was probably the only member of his family capable of putting it back together, and then, in 715 or early 716, he escaped. The sources don't tell us how. No dramatic prison break narrative survived. One day he's imprisoned, the next he's gathering supporters in the Ardennes forest. Did Plectrude's guards take bribes? Did allies break him out? Did he pick a lock with a chicken bone and seduce a guard with his roguish charm? We'll never know. But what matters is this: Charles was free, and he was angry. Here's where Charles Martel begins to show what he's made of. Put yourself in his position. You're a bastard with no official title, no treasury, no army, and no legal claim to power. Your stepmother controls the government. Your legitimate half-brothers are dead. But their children have the family name and the official sanction of the nobility. You have nothing but your sword, your father's reputation, and your own abilities. What do? Charles went to war. He gathered supporters, younger sons, disenfranchised warriors, people who'd been passed over by Plectrude's government, and people who simply recognized talent when they saw it. With this ragtag force, he started winning. First, he had to deal with the Neustrian rebellion. At the Battle of Amblève in 716, Charles faced a Neustrian army that outnumbered his forces. He lost. His first major battle as a commander, and he lost. Lesser men would have given up. Lesser men would have fled to another kingdom, would have taken service as a mercenary, would have accepted that maybe being a bastard meant you didn't get to make history. Charles regrouped and attacked again. At the Battle of Vincy in 717, Charles met the Neustrians again. This time he won decisively. Not just won, crushed them. The Neustrian forces broke and ran, and Charles pursued them all the way back to Paris. And this is where we start to see the pattern that would define Charles Martel's military career. Aggressive, relentless, personally leading from the front. He didn't win through superior numbers or better equipment. He won through speed, surprise, and sheer unbreakable will. Within a year of escaping prison, Charles had defeated the Neustrians, cowed the nobility, and forced Plectrude to hand over what remained of the royal treasury. She disappeared from the historical record after 718, probably retired to a convent, probably deeply regretting that whole imprison the military genius strategy. Charles was now the mayor of the palace. The bastard had won. But winning the civil war was just the tutorial level. The real challenges were about to begin. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the world Charles Martel had just risen to power in, because context matters. In 717, the year Charles consolidated his power in Francia, the Umayyad Caliphate was laying siege to Constantinople. Think about that. The Islamic Empire that had emerged from Arabia less than a century before now controlled territory from the Indus River to the Atlantic Ocean. They'd conquered Persia, Egypt, North Africa, and most of Spain. They'd built an empire larger than Rome at its height, and they'd done it in the span of a single human lifetime. This wasn't just military conquest. This was a civilization at its peak. Baghdad and Damascus were centres of learning, art, and science. The Umayyad Caliphs commanded wealth that made European kings look like paupers. Their armies were professional, well-equipped, and led by commanders who'd been fighting continuously since childhood. And in 711, they'd crossed into Europe. A Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad led an army across the Strait of Gibraltar, which is literally named after him. Gibraltar comes from Jebel Tariq, or Tariq's mountain. Within 7 years, the Umayyads had conquered virtually all of the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Spain simply ceased to exist. By the 720s, Umayyad forces were probing across the Pyrenees into Francia. Charles spent the 720s playing whack-a-mole with crises. The Saxons kept raiding in the northeast, so he'd march an army there and beat them back. The Frisians would rise up in the north, so he'd pivot and crush them. The Aquitanians would assert independence in the south, so he'd march south and remind them who was in charge. He fought the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Burgundians. He was constantly in the saddle, constantly fighting, constantly reinforcing his power through military victory. Because here's the thing about being mayor of the palace instead of king. You had no dynastic legitimacy, no divine right, no ceremonial authority. You had one source of power, your ability to win battles. And Charles won. Constantly, obsessively, brutally. It was during these campaigns that he earned his nickname, Martel, the Hammer. Not because he wielded a war hammer into battle, though the image is cool, but because of how he fought, smashing into his enemies with overwhelming force, breaking them completely, leaving no room for them to recover and rebel again. He wasn't trying to be loved. He was trying to be feared, and it worked. But all these campaigns, the Saxons, the Frisians, the internal rebellions, these were warm-up acts. The main event was coming from the south. Abdul-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was everything the Umayyad Caliphate could ask for in a general. He'd risen through the ranks through sheer competence, leading campaigns across North Africa and into Iberia. He was strategic, patient, and absolutely committed to extending the Caliphate's reach into Europe. And in 732 he was appointed Wali, governor of Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. Abdul-Rahman looked north and saw opportunity. The Duchy of Aquitaine, under Duke Odo the Great, was wealthy, fractious, and barely under Frankish control. Odo had been fighting with Charles for years, sometimes allied, sometimes independent, always trying to maintain Aquitaine's autonomy. In other words, divided, distracted, and vulnerable. Abdul-Rahman assembled an army. The exact size is debated. Medieval chroniclers loved inflating numbers. Christian sources claimed anywhere from 60,000 to 400,000 men. Muslim sources, which tend to be more reliable about their own numbers, suggest something between 20,000 and 30,000. Whatever the real number, it was big, and it was professional. Umayyad cavalry, Berber warriors, infantry from across the Caliphate. They crossed the Pyrenees in the spring of 732. They swept through Aquitaine like a flood. The city of Bordeaux fell. The invaders burned it to the ground. They crushed Odo's army at the Battle of the River Garonne. Odo barely escaped with his life. Then they turned toward the Abbey of Saint Martin of Tours, one of the wealthiest religious sites in Francia. This wasn't just about conquest. This was about wealth. The Abbey of Tours was loaded with gold, jewels, religious relics and treasures. It was a prize worth taking. And it was at this moment that Odo the Great, the proud duke who'd spent years resisting Charles Martel's authority, made a choice that must have burned like acid. He asked Charles for help. Charles, to his credit, didn't gloat. He mobilized. Here's what makes Charles Martel's response to the Umayyad invasion remarkable. Speed. Moving a medieval army was like moving a city. You had thousands of men, horses, supply wagons, camp followers. Armies typically moved about 10-15 miles per day. Gathering forces from across Francia, marching south, and intercepting an enemy army already deep in Aquitaine should have taken months. Charles did it in weeks. He called up his veteran soldiers, men who'd fought with him for years, who trusted him completely. He mobilized the Frankish levy, the common freemen who owed military service. He gathered his nobles and made it clear. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about who had authority over Aquitaine. This was about survival. If Tours fell, Paris was next. If Paris fell, all of Francia would be open to conquest. Charles force-marched his army south. He knew exactly where Abdul-Rahman was headed. Tours was the obvious target, sitting there fat and rich and sacred. So Charles positioned his army between the Umayyad forces and the abbey. and then he waited. The two armies made contact in mid-October 732, somewhere on the old Roman road between Tours and Poitiers. The exact location is lost to history. No archaeological evidence has ever been definitively linked to the battle, which tells you something about how quickly medieval battlefields could be scavenged and forgotten. For 6 days, the armies faced each other without engaging. 6 days. Think about that. Two massive forces camped within sight of each other, both commanders taking their time measuring the opposition, looking for advantage. Abdul Rahman saw the Frankish army and must have done some mental calculations. His cavalry had swept through every opposition they'd faced. The heavy cavalry of the Umayyad Caliphate was the medieval equivalent of a tank division, armoured horsemen with lances, swords, and decades of institutional knowledge about breaking infantry formations. Charles saw the Umayyad cavalry and made a decision that would define the battle. He would fight defensively. This was radical. Frankish warriors were not famous for their discipline. They were famous for their aggression, for charging into battle with berserker fury. Asking them to stand still while cavalry charged at them was like asking water to flow uphill. But Charles had something going for him. His men trusted him completely. He'd led them to victory after victory. They'd seen him fight at the front of every battle. If Charles the Hammer said stand still, they'd stand still. On October 10th, 732, though some sources say it was October 11th or 12th, medieval chroniclers were not great with specific dates. Abdul Rahman gave the order to attack. Picture it. The Umayyad heavy cavalry, resplendent in their armour, forming up for the charge, the thunder of hooves, the glint of steel, the battle cries in Arabic, and then the charge, thousands of horsemen bearing down on the Frankish lines. The Franks stood in formation, shields locked, spears braced. Not a single man broke ranks. The cavalry hit the shield wall like a wave hitting a cliff, and the cliff held. Here's what the Frankish infantry had going for them. They were big. Frankish warriors were taller and heavier than most of their Mediterranean counterparts, products of a diet heavy in meat and dairy. They wore thick leather and mail armour, and most importantly, they were packed so tightly together that there was physically nowhere for horses to penetrate. Horses, no matter how well trained, will not willingly charge into a solid wall of spears and shields. They'll pull up short. They'll try to go around. They'll rear and panic. The Umayyad cavalry charged again, and again, and again. And each time, the Frankish shield wall held. Contemporary accounts describe the Franks as standing like a wall of ice, immobile, absorbing charge after charge. Charles had turned his army into a human fortress. But here's the thing about defensive battles. You're not trying to win through your defense. You're trying to exhaust the enemy, to blunt their momentum, to create the moment when they're disordered and vulnerable. Charles was waiting for that moment. The battle raged all day. The Umayyad forces, frustrated by their inability to break the Frankish lines, began to lose cohesion. Individual units attacked at different times. Gaps appeared in their formation. And then, late in the day, something happened in the Umayyad camp. Accounts vary on what exactly triggered it. Some sources say Frankish scouts had infiltrated behind the Umayyad lines and attacked their camp, threatening the enormous amount of plunder the invaders had collected. Others say it was a rumour, a panic that spread through the camp followers. Whatever the cause, the effect was immediate. Umayyad cavalry began breaking off from the battle and riding back to protect their camp. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the brilliant general who'd commanded armies across the Islamic world, rode into the chaos to rally his troops. And somewhere in that confusion, Abdul Rahman was killed. The sources disagree on how. Frankish chronicles claim Charles personally struck him down, which would be great drama but is probably propaganda. Muslim sources simply note that he fell in battle, surrounded by Frankish warriors. What's certain is that the Umayyad commander was dead and his army knew it. As night fell, the Umayyad forces retreated to their camp. The Franks, exhausted, did the same. Charles the Hammer had no idea if he'd won. He knew the Umayyads had withdrawn, but they still had a massive army, still had their cavalry, still had the capability to attack again in the morning. He ordered his men to hold their positions, to rest but stay ready, to prepare for another day of battle. The morning of October 11th dawned cold and misty. Charles sent scouts forward to assess the Umayyad positions. The scouts returned with astonishing news. The Umayyad camp was empty. During the night, the entire army had packed up and retreated south. Without their commander, in hostile territory, deep in Francia with no clear line of succession in the command structure, the Umayyad commanders had made the prudent decision to withdraw while they still could. Charles had won. Not through a crushing cavalry charge, not through tactical brilliance that destroyed the enemy army in the field, but through sheer stubborn defence that had broken the enemy's will to fight. Let's be clear about what the Battle of Tours was and wasn't. It wasn't the end of the Islamic presence in Europe. The Umayyads still controlled Spain, and would for centuries. There would be more raids across the Pyrenees, more battles, more back-and-forth conflict. Charles himself would fight several more campaigns against Umayyad forces in the 730s. It wasn't even the largest battle Charles fought. He'd fight bigger engagements against the Saxons, the Frisians, and various rebellious Frankish nobles. But it was the battle that stopped the Umayyad advance at its furthest point. After Tours, there would be no more deep penetration raids into Francia, no more threats to Paris, no more realistic possibility of Islamic conquest of Christian Europe. And it was the battle that transformed Charles Martel from a Frankish warlord into a legend. Word of the victory spread across Christian Europe. Here's how the Mozarabic Chronicle, written by Christians living under Muslim rule in Spain, described it. The northern peoples remained as immobile as a wall, holding together like a glacier in the cold regions. In the blink of an eye, they annihilated the Arabs with the sword. As immobile as a wall, like a glacier. This wasn't flowery medieval exaggeration. This was a description of a tactical approach so novel, so unexpected that it shocked contemporary observers. Charles understood something crucial. He couldn't beat the Umayyads at their own game. Their cavalry was superior. Their tactics were refined by a century of constant warfare. But he could neutralize their advantages by refusing to fight the kind of battle they excelled at. In modern military terms, Charles Martel had invented a counter-doctrine, but victory at Tours was just one chapter in Charles's continuing campaign to dominate Francia and its borderlands. The 730s were Charles Martel's decade of absolute dominance. He continued his campaigns against the Umayyads, pushing them back across the Pyrenees. In 736, 737, he launched major expeditions into Provence and Septimania, regions that had fallen under Umayyad control or influence. He besieged Avignon, he took Nimes, he systematically reclaimed Frankish territory. And he was brutal about it. When he retook Provence, sources describe him burning and looting monasteries, destroying churches, confiscating church lands. This wasn't random violence, this was strategic. The church had grown wealthy and powerful, and Charles needed resources to fund his constant military campaigns, so he took them. This created tension. The Pope was not happy about a supposedly Christian ruler sacking churches. But here's the thing, what was the Pope going to do about it? Excommunicate the man who just saved Christian Europe from Islamic conquest? Charles operated in a space beyond normal political rules. He wasn't a king. The Merovingian puppet kings still technically ruled Francia. He was just the mayor of the palace. But everyone knew where the real power lay. He also continued his campaigns in the north and east. He fought the Saxons repeatedly, brutal campaigns across the Rhine, burning pagan temples, forcing conversions at sword point. He conquered Frisia, he subdued Bavaria, he brought the Alemanni to heel. By the late 730s, Charles Martel controlled a territory larger than any Frankish ruler since Clovis, and he'd done it without ever claiming the title of king. Why not? Why not just depose the useless Merovingian and crown himself? Probably because Charles understood power better than most. Titles are just words. Real power comes from armies, from wealth, from the ability to make people obey you. The Merovingian kings gave him a useful fiction. He could act in the king's name, could maintain the illusion of continuity, while exercising absolute control. Plus, there was a religious dimension. The Merovingian dynasty claimed to be divinely ordained. They had long hair. Cutting a Merovingian king's hair was symbolically stripping him of his royal power. There was mystique there, sacred authority that couldn't simply be manufactured. Charles didn't need the mystique, he had the hammer. Charles Martel died on October 22nd, 741. He was probably in his early 50s, though remember, we don't know his exact birth date. He died at his villa in Quierzy-sur-Oise, surrounded by his family, having divided his territories between his sons, Charlemagne and Pepin the Short. There's a beautiful irony here. Charles the Bastard, who'd been excluded from inheritance, who'd had to fight his own family for power, carefully arranged the succession between his legitimate sons. He'd learned from his father's mistakes. And this is where Charles Martel's true legacy begins to unfold. His son Pepin the Short would eventually do what Charles never did, depose the last Merovingian king and claim the crown for himself, founding the Carolingian dynasty. And Pepin's son, a boy named Charles, named after his grandfather. History would call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He'd build an empire that would dominate Europe, would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, would create a Carolingian Renaissance that preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages. Every European royal house from the Middle Ages to the modern era would claim descent from Charlemagne, which means they were claiming descent from Charles Martel, the bastard who should have died in prison, who should have been a footnote in Frankish history. Instead, he became the grandfather of European royalty. Charles Martel died almost 1,300 years ago. His kingdom no longer exists. The Merovingians he propped up vanished into history. The Umayyad Caliphate he fought collapsed in revolution just a few years after his death. But his legacy is everywhere. Every time we talk about Europe as a distinct civilization, we're implicitly invoking the world Charles helped create. A world where Western Europe remained Christian, where Frankish power laid the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire, where the cultural trajectory led to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. Would those things have happened anyway in an alternate timeline where tours went differently? Maybe. Probably. History is shaped by deep forces that transcend individual battles. But Charles didn't know that. He just knew there was an army between him and Tours, and he had to stop it. And he did. With discipline, with strategy, with the bone-deep stubbornness of a man who'd refused to accept his fate since the moment he was born. The bastard who became the Hammer, the man who fought his way out of prison and into legend, the grandfather of Charlemagne, the defender of Tours, Charles Martel. If you learned something, or if this story made you think about how individual lives can shape the course of civilization, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories from history, and drop a comment. I read them all. Thanks for listening. Until next time.